What's up, Chooms? Welcome back to Darth Matu's Holocron. Today, we are diving back into the world of Cyberpunk 2077, where we are going to explore America and the new USA a bit closer. If you are new to Cyberpunk, I did a general timeline video that I will link below. Check it out for more background. The rest of my returning friends, I have a lot going on in the background right now, but you can expect some more videos here in the near future. The Praxeum continues to proceed. For those who don't know, that's a non-profit I'm helping to start that focuses on Star Wars Legends. We are hoping to hold a Star Wars Legends convention at the end of next year, so if that interests you, check out the links to the Discord, Reddit, all that good stuff down below. I've also started my own personal Discord, and I'll include a link to that as well, so come and hang out. Alright, that's enough bullshit. Let's get back to the dark future. America, 1989. As you guys know, history unfolded much the same as it did in our world up until this fateful year. 1989 was the year that the Gang of Four was born. Now, all of you have probably heard the crazy conspiracy theories about the Deep State or Illuminati or whatever. Cyberpunk assumes those theories are true, and that the Deep State was the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four was made up of the US intelligence agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the DEA, and the NSA. And the gang seized complete control of the US government by the end of 1989. However, it's important to understand that this control was behind the scenes, hidden from the people at large. They kind of moved behind the shadow of the US government, and their activities would only come to light over years as they enacted their plans. The first of which was the First South American Conflict. The First South American Conflict was a series of wars that was designed to supplant growing economic independence in Central and South America, and they were launched in the early 90s. Latin American countries were becoming increasingly developed, which in turn threatened US-based megacorporations who had been using South America as a kind of piggy bank, both for offshore accounts and natural resources. The NSA and CIA began to arm rebel groups in these countries, undermining their sovereignty, while the DEA and the FBI targeted South American drug cartels, giving the US cause belli to launch invasions of the southern continent. The Gang of Four would also unleash artificially developed plagues on the world during this time, using designer diseases to target the crops of cocoa and opium in South America and Central Asia. At the same time, US-backed rebels in Chile and Bolivia overthrew the governments there and gave the US access to vast reserves of precious minerals. Most of Latin America was not really capable of responding to these situations. They were developing, but they were still developing. So, standing up to a nation like the US that had been spending billions on their military for decades just wasn't in the picture. But the same thing could not be said of the drug cartels. The drug cartels had also been making billions and spending it on arms and on soldiers for decades, and they discovered who was responsible for the bioplagues that had decimated their crops. They launched terrorist strikes against the US in response, but this played directly into the Gang of Four's hands, allowing them to launch an actual military invasion of South America. The US completely outclassed the cartels, but the conflict was asymmetrical. The drug cartels and, in turn, many of the South American militaries refused to fight the US straight up, falling back into the rough terrain of the rainforest and mountains, using hit-and-run tactics reminiscent of Vietnam or Afghanistan. They remained constantly on the move, and they launched insurgent strikes at US territory across the world. Things would come to a head in 1993 when the drug cartels detonated a small nuclear device in New York City. It absolutely devastated the place and killed over 15,000 people. South America, though, was not the only theater of competition for the Gang of Four. Europe had become a rapidly rising power by the early 90s, and in 1992, they formed the European Economic Community, essentially a more powerful version of the real-world European Union, one which turned much of Europe into essentially one loosely affiliated political entity. The EEC established the Eurodollar as their shared currency, and the Eddy, as it came to be called, quickly rose to prominence on the international stage, threatening the US dollar as the standard for trade. This was a huge threat to the Gang of Four's idea of global hegemony, and so, while they waged war in South America, a more covert kind of conflict was directed towards Europe and Asia. The gang would hack into servers in both polities and artificially adjust the data there to hold back the eurodollar and the yen, while also artificially boosting the US dollar. The EEC, however, was not idle, and they spent years investigating the manipulation, eventually uncovering the truth. Interpol formally charged the United States with stock manipulation and money laundering in 1994. The resulting financial panic caused a complete collapse of the world economic market. The US dollar, up until then, had been the accepted international currency. Now, however, people knew that they couldn't have any confidence in it, and the value of the US dollar fell straight through the floor. Meanwhile, years of environmental degradation continued to take their toll. The 90s were a period which saw rising sea levels and the start of mass desertification. Acid rain started to become more common and the ocean currents began to shift. The US Midwest began its transition into a dust bowl that made the Great Depression look like a vacation. Farmers were put out of business en masse, either by the climate or by corporate interests moving in. Food became harder to come by, and more people were forced onto the road, roaming from place to place in search of supplies and shelter. These Americans became the first nomads, forming a new social class within the country. Social order began to break down, and criminal elements rose up to take control. Gangs became more powerful than ever, people banding together to survive. Some pre-existing criminal elements were well positioned to take advantage of the chaos, with the Bloods gang, the one from real life, managing to seize control of the entire state of Florida by 1995. Richard Knight, a successful American businessman, was very much aware of the deteriorating situation in the world, and he worried for the future of humanity. So, he set out to realize a dream. He wanted to create a futuristic, utopian city of the future where people could live free from want and crime, and he founded a company called Knight International to see that dream through to completion. Construction started on his Coronado City in 1993, with the city officially founded in 1994. Arasaka, Euro Business Machines, and Petrochem were all convinced by Knight to provide funding and resources. Fun fact, Coronado City stands on the site of a real-life city that had been abandoned during the time of the Troubles in Cyberpunk, called Morro Bay. You can actually go and visit Morro Bay in California today, though I hear that it is maybe not the safest place in the world. The Gang of Four responded to the rising crisis by recalling the US military and ending the first South American conflict in 1994. They declared martial law, and the military enforced this rule with a harshness that hadn't been seen in the country since the British. Savage, inhumane tactics were the name of the day, and the military even killed 2,000 people via an artillery barrage in Houston when protesters refused to disband. Many states began to reject the rule of Washington, refusing to send taxes back to the capital, and even using their national guards to combat the federal military. This period was known as the Collapse, and it was well underway by 1996, with state after state breaking away, declaring their sovereignty as free states. The Gang of Four scrambled to hold on to the pieces, mostly managing to keep the East Coast under control. But the United States, as it had been, passed into memory, ceasing to exist. 1998 proved to be perhaps the worst year in American history. A 10.5 magnitude earthquake struck Los Angeles, killing 65,000 people and submerging almost half the city into the sea. Richard Knight, who had long stood opposed to organized crime, moving into his beloved utopia, was assassinated by the mafia. Coronado City was renamed Night City in his honor, but there was nothing standing in the way of organized crime without him. The thugs moved in, and Night City soon became a warren of crime and anarchy. Society continued to all but cease to exist outside the cities, with many smaller towns and cities completely abandoned. The land between the big cities became filled with raiders, nomads, and other transients. Nuclear power plants were left unattended, and their eventual meltdowns only added to the environmental degradation that the world was facing. Things got so bad that martial law was ended in the United States in 1999, not because things were better, but because the Gang of Four simply did not have the resources or the jurisdiction to enforce it. California had seceded, splitting into two states, Northern and Southern California, but they were far from alone. Texas, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Washington, Oregon, almost all of the states west of the Mississippi had split from the US and were considered by the Gang of Four to be in a state of open rebellion. This left the US completely unable to respond to internal emergencies, such as the emergence of the wasting plague in 1999. The wasting plague was a terrible sickness that seemingly came from nowhere, attacking the intestines of those afflicted and ensuring that they starved to death no matter how much food they ate. It spread like wildfire across the world, killing millions, and the Gang of Four completely ignored it, allowing it to ravish unchallenged through American populations. The epidemic was only brought to an end when Japanese doctors finally managed to produce and distribute a viable vaccine. Things were only exacerbated by the emergence of millennium cults across the US, groups who were convinced that the world would end on January 1st, 2000. These cults would steadily work to undermine the already fracturing web of society, and many would actually go out in an explosive, violent outburst on New Year's of 1999, wreaking havoc across a devastated America. Despite these catastrophes, the world continued to progress in certain ways, with technology never slowing its rapid advance. Even the US, in its sorry state of anarchy and unrest, saw an explosion of tech, with things like cybernetics becoming near ubiquitous in the mega buildings that had been built over the ruins of old towns. The EEC fared much better, and began to establish a presence in space, building colonies off-world and massive space stations in high orbit. Tycho Colony was established on the moon in 1997, and construction of the Crystal Palace, a massive space station at the L1 Lagrange point, began in the year 2000. This was a grave threat to the Gang of Four's waning power. A foothold in high orbit would prove to be an advantage that the US could not overcome, and the gang began to lay covert plans to address this issue. Meanwhile, things began to accelerate around the globe. The first framework for the net was set up in 2001, bringing people closer together than ever. Then, in 2002, the food crash came. Strange diseases struck across the globe, particularly in the USSR. The United States was able to survive this catastrophe by developing a counteragent to save their food supply, and many people grumbled that the crash was actually perpetrated on purpose by the Gang of Four in an attempt to weaken the new global order and improve their own position. The gang would launch into yet another war the very next year, in 2003, starting the Second South American conflict. This war was a last-ditch, desperate attempt by the gang to catapult the US back onto the global stage by conquering vast swaths of South America. They sent the US military to invade several countries, using their former foes, the drug lords, as a false front to wage war. The EEC and the USSR watched these events unfolding with concern, but they decided not to get directly involved, instead feeding arms and supplies to local fighters. The US was, again, fighting in tropical and often mountainous terrain against determined fighters who knew their homeland. Things rapidly turned yet again into a slog like Vietnam or Afghanistan, with thousands of Americans returning home injured and scarred. Cyberware helped to offset the physical negatives, but many veterans were tossed a basic implant and left to fend for themselves. Rates of cyberpsychosis went through the roof, and the people back in the United States grumbled, unhappy with the war. The first corporate war began during this time, and the second and third corporate wars would also rage in the background over the next couple of decades, devastating the environment internationally, and weakening the hold of governments pretty much everywhere. We're gonna talk more details on the corporate wars in another video, but for now we're gonna move on because the US became more and more focused on internal affairs between the years 2003 and 2010. Years and years of unrest finally taking their toll. They wouldn't directly become involved in these conflicts until later. The Gang of Four was much too busy with their projects in South America and in orbit. As stated before, the EEC's dominance in space was a severe threat to what remained of American global power. The Gang of Four needed to take a slice of the orbital pie, but they lacked the resources to do it themselves. The Neo-Soviets were also attempting to take a stake in space and were building an orbital platform of their own. The Gang saw a chance to gain their foothold and set their enemies back at the same time, so they launched a short conflict that would become known as the Orbital War in 2008. The EEC would intervene on behalf of the USSR, using their mass drivers to drop an asteroid on Colorado Springs, completely destroying the city and devastating the surrounding countryside. The US was forced to sign a grudging peace with Russia, but this was not their last attempt to upset the apple cart. The Gang would try again in 2009, this time launching a plot to seize control of the Crystal Palace, the massive space station that the EEC had funded. The EEC, however, would discover this plot, and they would drop another asteroid off the coast of Washington as a warning, putting an end to the attack and effectively ending American international power. These events happened around the same time a World News Service journalist, Tesla Johannesson, was releasing information on the Gang of Four. Tesla had been investigating them for some time, and their scoops pushed the US president into reaching out to Special Operations Command, a faction of the US military that was buried deep within the CIA. The president offered immunity in return for testifying to the Gang of Four's inner workings, and Special Operations Command accepted. The crimes of the Gang of Four were made public, and the US would embark on a 4-year military campaign to destroy the NSA and other collaborators within the Gang of Four across the world. They were aided in this process by splinter groups from the CIA that were reorganized and then absorbed back into the government. Civilians even helped in this cleansing, with people hunting down then President Hunt and burning him to death somewhere in the Florida Everglades. The gang was completely shattered by 2008, but the US was very far from better. Years of abuse had taken their toll. Cities lay abandoned, the environment was abused beyond recovery. The country was broke, disorganized, and martial law was declared again. The US military was forced to withdraw from South America, ending the Second South American conflict. However, the military didn't fight alone. They had been in bad shape for a long time, and they had been forced to rely on the work of thousands of contractors during the war, many of them nomads. These contractors were left to fend for themselves, completely abandoned in a hostile land with no resources or help. They were forced to walk all the way back home, and this period would come to be known among nomads as the Long Walk. Thousands would die along the journey, with only 10% of those who helped the US military returning home from South America. The following years for the US consisted mostly of internal focus, on building up the reputation of the country globally after acting for nearly 2 decades as the world's bad guy. The US signed a mutual defense treaty with China in 2009, and they signed another treaty with the EEC in 2013, formalizing the formation of NetWatch, the international group dedicated to policing and protecting the net. Recovery began to come slowly, but it was in fits and starts. Things were relatively quiet until 2019 when President Elizabeth Kress took office. Elizabeth was a very sly politician who likely assassinated her predecessor, and she would use the events of the following years to remain in power for almost 3 decades, taking the US back to an authoritarian regime. But that lay a little bit in the future, the development of events over time. President Kress came to office during a time of transition, when international trade was beginning to break down and when environmental pressures were becoming too much for everyone. Acid rain had become commonplace, and less fertile land was available for farming. Large tracts of the world were poisoned by radiation or pollution, and animals were dying off en masse. Governments struggled to maintain their sovereignty in the wake of megacorporations hoovering up power and devastating the globe in the conflicts that I already mentioned, the corporate wars. The US would not become directly involved in these conflicts until 2021, when the Fourth Corporate War began to boil. The Fourth Corporate War began when a megacorporation known as IHAG, specializing in international shipping, went bankrupt. Sino and OTEC, two rival companies, butted heads over the remains of IHAG, struggling with one another to cannibalize what remained of the first company. The conflict started silently, taking place mostly on the ocean where international law had no sway. OTEC and Sino struck against each other in a play of corporate politics. OTEC, however, stepped up its game by hiring Militech, the US-based arms giant that had been supplying the US military for years. Sino responded in kind by hiring Arasaka, the Japanese security corporation. This was when the war went hot. Militech and Arasaka were enormous megacorporations, and they had been looking for a way to prove who was dominant for a long time. The conflict between OTEC and Sino offered them a perfect excuse. In fact, OTEC and Sino would even negotiate a peace treaty early in the conflict, and Militech and Arasaka would continue to fight. They had used the conflict and turmoil of the previous decades to grow wealthy beyond belief, and they owned militaries that could rival some nations, able to project globally. So they fought one another across the planet in every nation. It started out slow, but increasingly became vicious as the corps realized nobody was going to stop them. Eventually, battles would come to include thousands of people. They used every trick in their respective books, unleashing armored units, cybernetic soldiers, netrunners, fighting in the digital space while they could, as well as the physical. Virus bombs were detonated in port towns across the world, further crippling international trade. The fighting even spread to the stars, with the conflict in orbit allowing separatist elements aboard Galileo Station and others to break away from the nations of Earth, declaring independence. Now, you may be wondering why I said they fought on the net while they could. Raish Bartmoss, an infamous netrunner, maybe the most infamous, was killed at the start of the fighting in 2022. Raish had helped to build the net years earlier, and he had incorporated a dead man's switch into its architecture that was known as the data crash. It was released upon his death, slowly spreading throughout the net, making it nearly unusable, trapping netrunners from both sides in the ever-shifting flow of data, and further breaking down the international order as people were cut off from one another. Things got so bad that the governments of the world began to respond, first on the local level, but slowly growing in strength. They began to enforce regulations that had been ignored for years, and even threatened to nationalize Militech or Arasaka assets within their borders if the fighting did not stop. Things finally reached a head on August 20th, 2023, when a small group of cyberpunks led by the infamous Johnny Silverhand detonated a pocket nuke inside Arasaka Tower in Night City. This devastated the city and acted as the last straw for the governments of the world. President Kress moved to nationalize Militech, bringing the security giant firmly under the control of the US government. The rest of the world quickly followed suit, following through on their threats and nationalizing billions in company assets. Militech was folded directly into the US governmental structure, and Arasaka was severely limited, forced only to do business within Japan for years. The years 2023 to 2025 were known as the time of the Red. The atmosphere had been filled with tons of dust and debris, particles tossed into the sky by mass driver impacts, nuclear explosions, and years of widespread warfare. The sky turned red, fully, for 2 entire years, and red sunrises and sunsets are still commonplace even in the time of Cyberpunk 2077. This did nothing to help the environmental degradation, actually accelerating it, making food even more scarce. But not everything was awful. Megacorporations had been broken by the Fourth Corporate War, and small businesses rose to fill the gap for the first time in decades. People started to recover on a local level, building tight-knit communities that raided abandoned corporate facilities for cyberware and resources. An event known as the Diaspora began in 2026, as the sky finally began to show signs of blue again. People set out to recover cities that had been abandoned since the collapse, Even Night City would see rebuilding in the 2030s, with new corporations rising to help fill the vacuum left by the old. The US would see steady recovery, the nation itself constituting the land east of the Mississippi. The Free States saw recovery as well, and a new status quo would fall for decades. Finally, in 2069, President Kress would allow free elections again, and see herself voted out of office by President Rosalind Myers, the former CEO of Militech. President Myers started her term by reorganizing the federal government into the new United States of America. Then, she presented the Free States with a unification program meant to bring them back into the new United States government. The Free States, however, after years of ruling themselves, had no interest and refused. And President Myers responded by launching a full invasion of the Free States on June 6, 2069. Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Montana, Arizona, Nevada, Northern California, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho all managed to avoid the fighting by offering concessions to the new USA. The rest of the Free States, organized into a loose alliance known as the Pacifica Confederation, came under assault by the new USA military. Sacramento was carpet-bombed, and Night City fell under siege. Things were looking pretty grim. The people of Night City essentially left to defend themselves. The Neo-Soviets in Arasaka supported the defenders with regular supply drops, but it was not until Councilman Lucius Rhine reached out to his Arasaka contacts asking them to return that any serious intervention was mounted. Arasaka responded to Rhine's request by sending the supercarrier Kujira to dock off Night City. President Myers signed the Treaty of Unification soon after, unwilling to risk the tenuous recovery of the new USA combating the likes of Arasaka. The Free States remained free, able to rule themselves, but they agreed to participate in the federal government and to cease all hostilities among themselves. Night City was declared a free international city on the border between Northern and Southern California, and President Myers was able to claim a win in strengthening the new USA. The country returned to licking its wounds, building its forces back up and strengthening their international position. The conflict was short, lasting just about a year and ending in June of 2070. And that will just about take us up to 2077. There are some other major events that happened, but they mostly have to do with Night City, so we will discuss them in another video. What is important to remember for now is that by the end of 2070, the new USA was a rising power. The world was settling down into a new status quo, but still struggled under serious problems, many of them environmental. Whole areas of the world becoming uninhabitable as a result of climate change. It is almost a guarantee that the new USA will go back to war with the Free States at some point. President Myers is not one to leave a job unfinished. For now, though, things have quieted down, and the cyberpunk world rolls on. Whether or not the new USA will succeed in its goals or completely collapse remains to be seen. But that's all I got for you today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, learned a little something about the alternate history of America in Cyberpunk. If you did enjoy the video, please hit like and subscribe. You made it this far after all, and there will be more lore videos coming soon. Until then, guys, take care of yourselves out there, stay safe, and may the Force break your chains.